Now, I want to talk about neurotoxic effects of sustained hypercortisolemia. And for probably 5 million years of human history, fight or flight responses probably lasted about 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, and they estimate that may have occurred 2 or 3 times a week. So we're talking about a very, very tiny amount of time that early humans, over the hundreds of thousands of years, actually had to experience a fight or flight response. The rest of the time they weren't, okay? But if you have very high levels of cortisol and they are sustained, then this is referred to as hypercortisolemia, and you see it in 4 different conditions. Okay, the first is in depression. It doesn't happen, hypercortisolemia does not occur in all cases of depression. Increases of cortisol do occur in all kinds of depression, but it's been estimated that only about 60% of people that have major depression, and that could be that's unipolar and bipolar disorder, about 60% will have hypercortisolemia. And we're going to see how this can affect the brain. If you are exposed to high levels of cortisol for 3 minutes, no big deal. But if you've got it there 24 hours a day times 6 months, which is what a lot of people with depression have, then it can take a significant impact on the brain itself. Cushing's disease is a rare condition, thank goodness. It's a disease. One version arises from abnormalities in the pituitary gland. Another version is tumors in the adrenal gland. But anyway, one of its main consequences is hypercortisolemia. Okay, chronic steroid exposure. What I'm talking about here primarily is the use of steroids to treat medical illnesses. And you better believe that there's a lot of people that end up taking steroids and may take them chronically. Especially people who have autoimmune diseases like irritable bowel and Crohn's disease, for instance, rheumatoid arthritis. There are some pain conditions where steroids can be helpful in reducing pain, and so on and so forth. So that's another source of hypercortisolemia. And actually, steroids are a form of glucocorticoid. Well, they're in a sense they're kissing cousins. A steroid is a molecule that's made from cholesterol, and so steroids that are used in treating these diseases are made from that sort of parent compound, as well as cortisol. Okay. Now, and finally, severe sustained stress accompanied by helplessness. Now, it's really important to emphasize that it's really got to be these 3 features. Because stress in general does not damage the brain. It doesn't, okay? But we're looking here at stress that is very severe, okay? That is chronic, day after day after day, and it's accompanied by an inability to escape, paralysis. Now, this is a little graphic here that presents photographs from the London bombing during World War II. And this had to be a real nightmare. You can see here between September of 1940 and May of 1941, frequently London was getting bombed by the Germans. And there was a period, I don't know when it happened, but there was a period during this time that there were 57 consecutive days of bombing. And every morning people would wake up and they would worry about, are my children going to get killed today? Okay, that's the kind of stress that we're talking about, what you see in a war zone. But there are other kinds of war zones as well in our culture, and primarily they are severe ongoing child abuse, domestic violence, and then elder abuse. Also, under Adult Protective Services, they classified this kind of abuse for people that are mentally or physically handicapped. So a person who has mental retardation is being abused, even though they're not an elder. Elder falls under that category. And I want to emphasize one thing. Domestic violence is something that lay people look at and they say, well, why in the world doesn't this woman just leave this abusive guy? And there are men that get abused as well, but most commonly it's women. And lay people having that conclusion don't get it. They don't understand the territory here. And as a psychotherapist, I know that that the kind of dynamics that are going on with people that stay in abusive relationships, their perception is that I can't get out of this. I'm powerless to do anything. Even though maybe, realistically speaking, they could walk away, but they stay engaged in kind of relationship oftentimes for a very, very long period of time. Now, we're going to see that toxic levels of cortisol can severely damage the brain. And it's important to say that it's not global brain damage, but it's very specific brain structures that are damaged by this, and it's those very structures that have a ton of GRs, glucocorticoid receptors, okay? So they're being overwhelmed by high levels of cortisol, and what that does is it activates apoptosis we talked about earlier in the semester, and that is cell death. So the first place we're going to talk about then where this brain damage occurs is, of course, in the hippocampus. And over a period of time, then, what are the consequences of that? Well, one thing is that it's going to impair the ability of the hippocampus to do its job in terms of affect regulation. And what you'll see clinically then is even though a person may not currently be in the state of major depression, maybe they'd had major depression a year ago, they've gotten beyond the depression, but they're carrying around this brain damage. So what's going to happen is that normal, let's say moderately stressful situations are going to cause reactions that are very intense, and their recovery time is prolonged. And so what we're talking about here then is a situation where many people that know this individual will say they're too sensitive. But I mean, and that's a criticism, that's a judgment, but that's their perception. But we're just to say that their ability to handle on a day in, day out basis emotions is not great, okay? And if a situation provokes a strong reaction, but then the danger goes away or the problem's been resolved, then people calm down. But that's the other piece of this affect regulation thing with hippocampus. It takes them a long time to settle back down. The other major thing that happens with regard to emotions is that once the hippocampus is damaged, it significantly increases the likelihood of having depression, major depression. Okay, we have affect regulation problems. The second area, though, where brain damage in the hippocampus takes a real toll on human beings is with regard to memory. We talked about this in an earlier class. Obviously, hippocampus is enormously important for the ability to acquire new information and then later to come back and be able to recall that. There are people who've lived through horrible, stressful situations as a kid, and maybe they eventually are taken out of their home and they're put in a loving foster home, and if they're lucky, they'll stay there maybe for a long period of time. But it could be very, very much the case that 3 years later or even 10 years later, after they've gotten out of the abusive environment, they have learning disabilities. And obviously there are specific learning disabilities like dyslexia, for instance, but this is a more generalized learning disability where, despite they're trying really hard to learn new information, the part of the brain that's so critical for being able to do that has been damaged. So it's bad news, okay? This slide shows on the left-hand side a part of the hippocampus, and you can see that there's where the arrows are, this very, I don't know if it looks that way to me, but very sort of regular distribution here of particular kinds of nerve cells. Over here, this is where these monkeys that were in this particular study got exposed to severe ongoing stress, and it's just laying waste to parts of the hippocampus, just massive cell loss. There now are studies that look at bipolar disorder and also unipolar depression, and they do MRIs, so they get sort of baseline MRI, and then follow that person for a period of time, and invariably try as hard as we can to encourage our patients to stay with treatment. Many people, especially if you have recurrent major depression or have bipolar, will go on to experience subsequent episodes. And what's been found then is that when people are followed over a period of time, and what's being monitored is the state of their brain, is there with additional episodes they have significant decrease in the volume of these brain structures. So you can literally see these things shrinking over a period of several years. Okay. Another thing, too, that I want to mention is that when people have this impairment of affect regulation in the hippocampus, one consequence is that when they do get stressed, okay, they are going to start secreting more of this molecule CRF, corticotropin releasing factor. And because they can't shut it off, then CRF can accumulate in larger amounts. And the one thing I want to say about CRF is that it is very potent in causing severe anxiety and depression. So when we were talking before about these people having a much greater vulnerability to major depression, this is a part of that, is that they can accumulate large amounts of CRF. And right now, this is sort of a testament to how big a deal this is. Every drug company in the United States is in the development of CRF blocking drugs. They think that if they can find one that is effective and safe, that they can revolutionize treatment of depression, or at least make $1 bazillion, right? So far, the molecules they found, the drugs they found that block CRF in animal studies cause liver toxicity, which can be potentially fatal. So currently, there are no safe CRF blockers, but the promise is that if they can find that, it may give us medications that are much more effective than currently available antidepressants. Now, we've already talked about depression as being a consequence of accumulation of high concentration of CRF, anxiety as well. But one last thing I want to add to the list are sleep disturbances. And we're going to talk a lot about sleep and sleep disorders later in the class. And one thing that CRF does is it significantly interferes with the ability to get into slow wave sleep, which is also deep sleep. And so many people that have this kind of severe chronic stress or depression, a lot of the sleep disturbance that you see clinically is happening because of the presence of this molecule.